Go ahead, Alan. This is Alan Morin, our vice president of Amnestis.
I just wanted to ask Rebecca a couple questions. First of all, there was a lot of illegal activity when it came to scrip. For example, some of my ancestors took scrip, but somehow the speculators took their scrip and sold it in southern Saskatchewan for land. And then when it came to money scrip, a lot of the speculators, like the banks, the churches, took the money scrip and kept the money to themselves. So in your research, which speculators were involved, which banks, which register order, that kind of stuff would be good to know, because I know they were part of the illegal activity that was happening when it came to scrip. And I just want to tell you a little story before we leave. This guy didn't know what to do with his money when they gave him scrip, so he decided to skip his money on the lake in Isle Cross. So it would skip about 4 or 5 times on the lake, and I believe some of that scrip money is still there.
No, and Alan, it's so true what you say. So it was like, I want to say it's the Royal Bank, right? It was the Canadian bank that was, so you had your table, people would line up. Let's say it's one that you had a scrip in treaty where they picked, right? So you picked your table, great. And then you walked over to the next table and you sold your scrip for what, 20 cents on the dollar? For nothing. And it was the way, it was a land speculation. I guess it would be, we would call it a scheme run by the government. I don't know. I have my strong opinions about it, right? But I mean, in a professional way, I wanted to say this. That like it really was. It was the bank that was showing up. They were there to buy it right off of them. And the government needed the land for settlers. So it was actually land speculating companies. There was these companies called colonizing companies that I found by accident one time in the Saskatchewan archives in the University of Saskatchewan campus in Saskatoon. I don't know if the provincial archives still have a holding in Saskatoon, but I was doing some research for Cowasis, I think it was. It might have been for Star Blanket. And I came across these colonizing companies. And then I started to connect the pieces and I saw, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so you have the government that is securing Aboriginal title to land by settling it with these scrip. They're selling the land certificates back to the government through the Bank of Canada, who is then connecting it to these land speculating companies. So if we go back to the Saskatchewan Atlas again, you can actually see where there's pockets according to ethnicities, because there was towns that were very exclusively Belgium and some were Flemish, and there's many Ukrainian ones and German ones. And if you notice, within the Ukrainian and the German populations that settled largely are homogenous in their religion. Well, how did that happen? That happened because the government took the land certificates, gave them, dealt with them with Métis, with the half-breeds through the scrip commissions, bought it back through their own bank, and then converted it over to these land speculating companies, which were the colonizing companies that were going to Europe and grabbing groups of people, not unwillingly. I'm not going to say that they weren't willing. I mean, this was an opportunity for people in Europe to own land where they never would have had that opportunity had they stayed over in the old country, right? So that was a huge new thing. They were going to move up in the world because they actually were going to become landowners. Some countries that never would have been able to be a reality, right? Because of the peasant farming and things like that that were going on overseas. So they come over because land speculators would get whole towns to come over. And you will notice that the quality of land that was not bought back by the land speculators were all the lands that didn't have good soil. Look at the Métis people that managed to keep the land, but the land is really sandy. The topsoil is not very black, but yet, so you look at Batoche, look at the land of Batoche, it's very sandy over there, but you just go over just a few miles and the earth is black. And it's good crops. And it's people that have been there for 3 generations that got everything through colonizing companies. I don't see it as an accident.
Good answer.
So we've got a comment here. Some say this was the biggest cash grab and misappropriation of funds in Canadian history. In time, many Métis were landless and without money. Banks like the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, Bank of Montreal, Royal Bank, as well as many private individuals got their start by the misappropriation of Métis land scrip. And in regards to the Louis Riel thing, the documents, it's been sent to my email. So I will forward that to you, Rebecca, and then you can have a look at it. Does anybody have any comments? If you have any comments or questions, you can just type it into the chat and then we could relay the questions to Rebecca. So one of the questions, what percentage of scrip did churches buy or get?
I'm not sure that that's ever been studied. I'm not sure. The churches were not heavily involved in the scrip directly. Churches are never directly involved in politics, but they're always involved in politics. And I say that with experience that I know from my dad coming out of Northern Quebec in the 1950s with the Duplessis government. Right. Churches would encourage their parishioners to be going certain directions politically or making certain donations or whatnot. But how much did it end up in their hands? I'm not sure. A lot of the church lands that they did secure, especially, as part of the colonizing efforts and the Christianization of Indigenous folks through the prairies, those were lands that would have been Hudson Bay lands, actually, at certain points. And I know that the Hudson Bay retained, when they did sell their land through the deed of surrender in 1869, the Hudson Bay did retain certain lands. It's just like the railroads. Railroads had a whole bunch of land after, but they always kept the ones that were I think they called it the right of way, right? So there's a certain amount of clearance on railroads that the CN and the CP rails have always kept when it comes to lands, because they even had certain controls of lands at times, but they've relinquished a lot of control, except for the ones that I think they call along the tracks like right of control. And it's the same with how the churches acquired some of their lands. I know LeBret is a very different situation, and it's always been a very different situation on how their land was secured and how their farm experiments ran, even during the social experiments during the Tommy Douglas government. What happened in LeBret was always a separate case than the rest of the social experiments done on Métis people in Saskatchewan. And it's sort of like Meadow Lake. When they did those relocation programs starting in the late 40s up until 1960 with Métis people, it was done through the social welfare rehabilitation branch of Saskatchewan, except for in Green Lake. That land was run under, called LID, the Land Improvement District. So there's always little exceptions to pockets and how some of these lands were acquired.
I'm just looking at the other question. In your opinion, M&O is looking at other historical Métis communities. Is evidence of them in Southern Ontario?
So I'm asking myself the same question ever since I came to Windsor. Because everybody keeps saying no to me, but I keep finding evidence that says yes. And that I follow the documents. I follow when evidence will land on my lap. I follow the family stories too, right? So I want to be really clear for myself that, like, as much as I won't promote anything that I can't back up through, historical records and things like that. But for me, historical record can include family stories as well, because it's just like knowledge. One thing that sort of irks me now is, recently I finished my official education. I'm going to be a lifelong learner, so I say official with quotes, and it's like sometimes people will treat me differently, and it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. There are elders in my world that know way more than me, that, the treatment is very, you need to make sure you're going to treat them as good as you're going to treat me, just because I happen to have, some title or whatever, right? Like, and it just irks me because that knowledge is important, right? So I don't want to discount community knowledge. I never discount it. But one thing I've noticed since coming here, it's like, okay, so even when I was finishing my dissertation, well, where did Guillaume Saylor come from? Well, he came from over here. I'm finding so many people that came from over here. And and people are saying, well, no. And it's like, but what's this? And they'll try and explain it away. So it's something I'm actually really interested in right now, to know what is the story. From what I see and from what I've seen and heard, a lot of people left the Detroit, Windsor area around the War of 1812. It was not their war. They did not want to be here. Whoever was here, so many people left. And I watched recently a history coming from an American perspective, more so on sort of like the colonization of North America. And it was something that was recently put together. It was on like National Geographic. It was directed by Leonardo DiCaprio, of all people. And they focus on Chief Tecumseh and some of the political alliances, and how there was like all this support all the way down to the Florida Panhandle, right, in supporting the British government, because the Americans were starting to cross over into, well, what would become Americans were starting to cross over into Indian territory, and they're not supposed to be crossing into Indian territory, right? And, you learn all these different stories by watching this series. Again, it's from American perspective, but then you get the understanding of what actually was going on in Detroit, because the War of 1812 was ground zero for, like, Detroit was ground zero. And it was like, no wonder there is so much conflict over the history. There's conflict between Canada and the US in the War of 1812 anyway. Right? We have songs just about how we disagree on the history, right? And like, then we have 300 years of history of Indigenous folks that have been left out of the colonial history, because that history didn't matter to the people who were writing the books for a long time. So now we are trying to figure out, we as, Indigenous folks in Canada are trying to figure out, where do we fit in these histories now? We have to put ourselves back into history. And now people are fighting over this history because we didn't have somebody else write it down from us 300 years ago, 200 years ago. That doesn't even make sense. We didn't need that for, eons. Why would we need somebody else to write our history for us now?
That's a really big thing that's going on right now, is that they're saying it's got to be written, but there's so much of our history that has always been oral. I know there's some really big controversies going on social media about, who's Métis, who's not Métis, and stuff like that. And it's not in the books, and well, there's lots of stuff that isn't in the books. I know even in my ancestry on the census in the, late 1800s, in one census they'll be listed as French, and the next census they're listed as Cree. And so, and it just depends on who, number one, who was taking the census. Was it somebody they trusted? I just found out my one grandma was raised at St. Laurent, just north of Batoche. And I just was, when I was talking to my mom the other day, I spent lots of time with all of my grandparents. So, and it didn't matter where we went. It was amazing, the family, and they knew everybody, like from their fifth cousin, from, it was, and everybody was related. But nowadays it's like it's some unique, and who's more Métis than the other, and it's I've been saying for quite a long time that, well, since the Daniels case, when the definition became more ambiguous, and that the government is not going to put itself in a position by defining that, basically they've they've set the dogs out on people, and are trying to play really nasty games. I actually put out a letter the other day from Amnestis, that our identity is not up for debate by any academics or public debate. It's the communities that need to determine who are their own. And yeah, because it gets quite scary, like, so how they talk to people sometimes on social media. Go ahead. Did you?
The thing is, whose books? According to whose books? So this book right here is a funeral book from 1948. And it's my great-great-grandmother, right? She was born in Golden Lake. Most of the people from Golden Lake came and signed this book. And you know the names that are in this book? La Jeunesse, Morin is in this book, right? But, like, that's why I say, like, community histories and family histories are important. And some of us are lucky to have, like, a funeral book where people sign the ledger and who the pallbearers were and things like that, right? And they sometimes forget, too, that, I hear this shaming, and it's like, oh, well, that was, 150 years ago. So I want to put some context and something on timing, because this is something that really resonates with me. So full disclosure, I'm 40. Okay. My dad was almost 50 when I was born. Okay. My grandmother was over 40 when my dad was born. My grandmother, not my great grandmother, my grandmother was born in 1894. My great grandfather was part of a mass enfranchisement. He was a baby when they did a huge mass enfranchisement in 1869. I just happened to be an exception because on my dad's side with our non-status, we were mass enfranchised, not individually enfranchised. So Bill S3 doesn't apply. That's just the one loophole. Like, it's really not that far. Now I think about this, and my mom was raised by her grandmother. My great grandma was a big part of my life until I was 12 years old. And she was the last one born that was raised. Like, my grandma, my mom's mom, was raised by her aunties until she was 16, and they were taken out and went to northern Quebec. Right. And I look at the family history and I hear these people saying, oh, well, some ancestor, 200 years ago. Well, my mom's generations, when she fills hers out, we actually are only, like, my mom is only 3 generations down from the Thomas line, from the original, like, root ancestor that people are complaining about right now. My mom had room to spare in generations on her family chart because we have huge family gaps. I have cousins that are 70. I have cousins that are 75 that are my first cousins. Like, I'm young compared to the rest of my family. If I was 20 or 30 years older, people would be, oh, whatever. But because I'm a young person, I must be grasping onto some ancestor from hundreds of years ago. When in my case, I just come from really big generation gaps in my family.
And realistically, like, you start doing that, 5-generation cutoff, and basically everything, that all that kind of discussion is all colonial discussion. That is something that our people have never done. When do you watch programs like Finding Your Roots, and they'll have the DNA, results and stuff like that. Well, if you're 5%, you're still, whatever. And that's just the way it goes. And I don't think that people realize that it's not as far back as you think. And we lived through the biggest change in culture during the industrial era. And lots of people, left the farming life and and systems changed, and lots of people's life experiences changed. And then there's lots of people too who are coming back trying to find their family history because of whether it be the 60s scoop or whatever, and they're facing this tirade on social media, and it's horrifying. Like you see somebody, they're not sure of the terminology, so they'll come on to, a social media page, and how do I go about getting my Métis status? And they'll be ripped apart because status is for Indians, and you mustn't be a real Métis because you don't know that Métis don't get status. And it's really, really horrifying. And in our organization, with Amnestis, we're working towards kinship and family and building and uniting. And, if anything, we want to go back and, bring that family unit closer instead of the divide and conquer, which is such a total government colonial mindset. And so we're going to start wrapping up, but
I just want to mention one thing. In the Daniels case, they say that they don't have to make, because there was like 3 declarations that Daniels was seeking. And one of the declarations, the judge said, it's a non-declaration because Métis and non-status are all still Indians at the end of the day. So I don't have to make that declaration, the judge said. The fact that people are dividing themselves according to that is that colonial understanding, because we don't need to separate that way. It's just something to think about. Like, I'm not trying to, tell people who they are or anything like that, but it's like, we need to think about why are we thinking in terms of separation of one group from another? Because if you look at First Nations groups, there's so many different kinds of First Nations groups, right? And it's like, whether you are Denisovan or Nehewin or, it's, you don't have to create those divisions. I'm just throwing that out there as something to think about.
It's really interesting because this all goes back to our discussion that we had last week with Saul Sanderson, and we were talking about the 500 years of colonization and colonization policy. And the government has inflicted all these policies on us and have made, Bill C-31 and, and stuff like that. And that's where that was created. And those fights still aren't over. There's still fights coming down the line in regards to that. When talking with Saul Sanderson, he's been around for a long time. He was involved in the 82 constitutional talks, etc. And he was saying that in talking with the Maori people in New Zealand, if you're 5% Maori, you're Maori. And there is no, well, you're a C-31 or whatever. If you are, you are. And so in the States, they have the blood quantum. And I think that's, and the colonial policy has been trying to do this forever. So, yes, what you're saying, Rebecca, is true, is Indigenous applies to us all. But I can see that the government is moving to try and really subjugate that and break it up some more. And I know that in that legal symposium that I took part in, is that the Daniels decision is probably going to, there'll be more legal cases from that, identifying things further. And it's really too bad that people feel they have to break it apart instead of building it up and keeping it together. Because I've always said that the government's biggest fear is all Indigenous people joining together. Because if, and that's always been their fear since the Pontiac Wars, everything else.
Never mind that, they actually wanted a homeland in the Cypress Hills. The First Nations people of Saskatchewan wanted a homeland in the Cypress Hills, and instead they were scattered all the way up to the Battleford Agency and everything. Absolutely, you're 100% right. And it was a divide and conquer tactic in the treaties and the way they set the reserves up, at least in what is present-day Saskatchewan.
Okay, we've got I can't see it, so I'll let Selena read it. Just give me a second here.
Okay, and I gotta turn down my sound. Okay.
From Jermaine Furlong, about the fifth generation debate, the federal government won't recognize a status Indian not registered before 1867. So if your mother was born just one day before the year 1867, you were not considered status. Strange as that sounds, as if your bloodline is wiped out.
I'm not sure if that's true on the East Coast. So I know that, the
You're muted,
Oh,
Rebecca.
the East Coast is a little different with the reserve creation because we were living in community lands starting in the 1820s, 1830s. And then our defining number for us out east was 1869. And so we were deemed not needing welfare. So our land was converted to fee simple in 1869. And then the government literally tracked us until 1951. We were still on the radar, but it was like basically reporting how crappy we're doing because we didn't put ourselves on reserve. And so it was because we had to apply for communal land grants to be able to keep in the 1810s, 1820s to keep living in our communities, and we had that secured. And we had that secured until that 1869. That's why the Second Amendment to Bill S3 went back to that 1869 cutoff rule and went back before that 1951, is because those are two significant years, but those are also the years that the groups that were suddenly non-status were then tracked until 1951. So, I mean, that's the experience in New Brunswick. I don't know, I can't speak for other. I know in Newfoundland, people in Newfoundland and Labrador were totally left out with Confederation in 1949 when they joined, and that's why it took a long road to get recognized in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they have their own processes. Nova Scotia and PEI, I'm not as clear, but I know in New Brunswick, there's at least 4 of our communities. Mine was one of them. We're Nipisiguit. I'm from the Salmon Clan, and that we were tracked until 1951. Like Indian Affairs reported on us as non-status groups that were just doing crappy.
Okay. So Jermaine comments back. I'll just read it and then we're going to have to move on because we've got like 2 minutes left. So she said, no, the same rules apply for NB today. At least a letter from INAC sent to me claims as much. So Jermaine, you might have to look Rebecca up at the University of Windsor and send her an email, and then you can discuss this further. I just want to thank Rebecca for coming out, and I'd like to thank our Vice President, Alan Morin, and our Secretary, Selena Epp, for being present, and I'd like to thank our WebEx administrator for hosting the event. Next week, we are back on Saturday, 2 to 4, and then we're back Wednesday from 7 to 9, and those times are Central Standard Times. And so we do have a website at amnesis.ca. We have a YouTube channel, and that's amnestis.ca, under Amnestis on YouTube. And we have a Facebook page, and it's called Association of Métis and Status Indians of Saskatchewan. So there's lots of ways to get a hold of us. It's an opportunity to learn. We're going to have Saul and Rebecca back again with us a couple more times this month, and then we're going to have Alan Moore, our vice president, speaking about more recent issues with the Métis and how what Amnestis used to be, and basically the history of Amnestis. So we look forward to seeing you all again. And thank you again, Rebecca. It's always good seeing you. And your knowledge is just amazing. So yes, please come back